Hi, everybody. I'm Erika Sanzi, the Director of Outreach here at Parents Defending Education. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we are talking about money. And with us, we have a very knowledgeable and special guest. His name is Todd Maddison, and he is the Director of Research at Transparent California, an organization which operates California's largest public pay and pension database with a vision to help Californians understand their right to know what their government is doing. He is also a longtime parental rights advocate in Oceanside Unified School District in California and serving on several school board committees in the last couple of decades. Todd, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Erika. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we've kind of boiled it down to two main reasons why we really wanted to talk to you. And first is that parents obviously focus a lot of their advocacy on things about school that is concerning them. So that could be gender ideology, racially divisive materials and lessons, hyper intrusive surveys being administered to their children, social emotional learning that they don't understand, and even questions about some of the books in their classrooms and in the libraries. But all of these things cost money. And so obviously that needs to be part of the conversation. The equity audit means that they're spending money on that and not on potentially literacy intervention and math intervention. So we want parents to start asking more questions about how their schools are spending their limited resources, and is that getting us what we need? And when I say what we need, the question would be about, are we seeing improved reading outcomes? Are we seeing better writing outcomes, math outcomes? Are we noticing that students show and demonstrate more knowledge of science and history, better civics awareness, or any civics awareness? And the answer is obviously most of the time, no. The second reason that we wanted to have you is that parents often tell us that they've had some success getting rid of some really terrible policies, or maybe they've had some success in getting their school district to switch to a curriculum that they find preferable. And they're not really sure where to focus their energies next. And so, we think that looking at school budgets is a really, really important place to focus some of those energies.
Absolutely. No, I think that, getting the bang for your buck is one of the most important things there is in any endeavor. In this case, of course, the product, so to speak, is the education of our kids. Is there anything more important? There is nothing more important than the education of our kids. When I look at my state, California, we see education and spending has increased radically. This year, they're scheduled to spend $127 billion on education in just our state alone. But yet, academic performance, at least as measured by the standardized test scores, is at best flat and in many cases down significantly. So if you looked at that and you said, okay, well, where do I need to push to get my kids a better education? Really, the push point is on the budget. They need to spend the money on things that actually improve education, not on things that might be nice and make people feel warm and fuzzy, but on things that actually improve education. And that's what we don't see. That's what parents need to push on.
And just to make sure people know, that's obviously not unique to California. I live in Rhode Island. We are what is called a high spending, low performing state. We kind of fall into the absolute worst of the four buckets. And again, spending continues to increase and outcomes aren't only terrible, but they are getting worse. So that's obviously a major concern, in a giant state like California on the West Coast, and even in a very small New England state where I am. Okay, so I guess first, I do want you to just tell us a little bit about your organization, Transparent California. Very cool title, by the way. And the work that you do as it relates to schools and school boards, because this does seem like something that, is replicable, maybe not even on such a large scale as what you're doing, but this push for transparency is a very important lever, I think, for parents as they engage in all of this with their kids' schools.
Sure. No, in California, and I assume in other parts of the country, what they spend on labor is the most significant part of any school budget. In California, 90 some percent of unrestricted funding is spent on labor. So, that's where you need to go. It's kind of like a home budget. If you were looking to balance your home budget, certainly it makes sense to watch what you're spending on Starbucks. But, if your spouse comes home with box seats to the local baseball team, that's a lot more significant than a few dollars on a Starbucks. So you got to look at where the money is going if you're going to make an impact. So here in California, we've seen spending skyrocket, particularly with ESSER funds, with the COVID mitigation funds. Last year, we spent $23,000, almost $24,000 per student educating kids. With an average class size of 27, that's almost $600,000 per class that we're spending to educate kids. Yet our academic performance hit a low that it's never seen before. And that's happening nationally too. If you look at the NAEP results, the National Association for, I forget what the acronym stands for, but they do annual testing on kids nationwide. If you look at SAT and ACT results, if you look at all of this, we've reached new lows everywhere when it comes to education, but yet funding is going way up. So that is really the question: is how can we allocate that? How, as parents, can we force our districts to allocate that in ways that benefit our kids? Transparent California looks at that compensation. We the labor cost. We look at we gather data from over 1,000 school districts in the state every year, and we look at from their actual pay records. This is not speculation. This is not a self-reported survey. We look at from actual data, where are they spending their money? And what we find increasingly is that they're spending it on themselves. That's what we find, is that if you look at the pay and benefits for your local education establishment, what you'll find is that the rate of climb of that cost is greatly exceeding inflation every year. Here in California, the rate of cost of increase for pay and benefits has gone up at almost 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation, depending on the district. Meanwhile, of course, performance is down. So that's what we need to look at. So Transparent California has about 38 million records of that. If you were a Californian, you could look up your local school district, your local, city, your local county, whatever you want, and you could see what they're being paid. If you're a parent in the school district in California, we encourage you to just read that list. Go to a board meeting, and when they tell you the reason we can't provide good education for our kids is because we don't get enough money from the state, read that list to them. The superintendent likely makes over $250,000 in most California districts. The other administrative staff makes hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, tell us that you can't afford to improve some aspect of education for our kids, and then look at your own salary when you're doing that. That's what I say. So that's what we do.
To the point you made about the over 90% going to labor, I had coffee with the Providence superintendent a bunch of years ago, probably maybe 5 years ago, and he said 97% of his budget was already spent before he could purchase a single book or curriculum or any sort of program. Like, they were so locked into those labor costs,
Hmm.
which obviously include the obligations to retirees as well. So again, not unique to California. In fact, sounds like it might even be worse. And that's in a district that has since been taken over by the state. Okay. So I guess, could you just help explain to those watching and listening where schools get their money from? Most people know that it's public, so they know
Hmm.
that it uses public dollars or tax dollars. But what does that actually mean? Um, and obviously, states are going to be different, so it might be helpful if you give sort of like maybe like 2 examples that are common in how this happens.
Sure. Well, in the dim dark past, schools almost always receive funding from local property taxes. Whatever you pay in property tax went to fund the school. Um, that chart started to change generally in the 70s, sometimes in the 80s. Um, States started to change their funding formulas so that they provided a more equitable source of funding. In property tax, I agree that funding schools by property tax is unfair, in part because it means that if you live in a very wealthy neighborhood, of course, your school is much better funded than if you don't live in a wealthy neighborhood. So in something called the local control funding formula. We pass some laws. And what that does is it takes a certain amount of funding from the state budget and then it allocates that out to the various districts. And it also has extra add-ons in there for kids that are low income, kids that are English learners, kids that meet special criteria, foster kids, so on and so forth. So generally, we provide more money to support those lower the special classes of kids that require more support. So that just makes sense. And now, as I understand it, that is becoming the default funding method for most of the country. There are still some states that I believe rely on property tax funding for some or maybe a big part of their local school funding. But I think over 2/3 of the states now fund their education through some form of allocation done at a state level, plus a little bit maybe extra. So,
So I guess so where I live, it's definitely property tax funded. Last number I saw was 77% of our property taxes go into our education, our school district. But our funding formula does take into account all the things that you're talking about there with low income, special needs, English language learners, I think. And I believe that that comes in the state allocation. So we're kind of like a like
hybrid.
a mix of all that,
Mhm.
but I remember when I lived in California, I taught in Coronado, actually, while my husband was stationed, uh, in San Diego with the Navy, and that's when I learned that in California, and correct me if I'm wrong, all the money goes up to the general fund in Sacramento, and then it's distributed based on the average daily attendance.
Mhm.
Whereas here where I live in the New England area, that does not happen. Like the money is property taxes goes straight from property taxes to the school district, and then additional monies come in based on the need levels of that school district.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, they're both somewhat valid methods of funding. There is an argument to be made that it gives local people more control when they have their property tax funding the schools. But we just need to make sure that we aren't doing that at the expense of kids that need higher levels of support or
Yep.
other additional things.
Okay, so rumor has it that you hate talking about bonds. But since so many of us went to the polls last night and had to vote on bonds or something similar, I know I did. We had something going on with a local elementary school. Just in a couple minutes, super like easy to understand. Can you just explain what are they?
Sure.
And also why are they important for parents and advocates to be aware of?
Sure. No, no. Bonds make my head hurt because there's a huge shell game that goes on with bonds. Passing it, paying for it, all these things are just not very transparent at all. What bonds are is in private industry. If you want to build a new facility, if you want to remodel, if you want to do that, you go to the bank, you take out a loan, and then the loan will eventually be repaid from the ongoing revenue of the company, the profits. School bonds are a little different. They are effectively a loan that the school takes out to remodel or build facilities, but they're not paid back by the school district. They're paid back by the people. So that would be kind of like if in a business, if you could build a new store and then every customer that walks through the door, they hand you $5 or $10 to pay for your new store somewhere else. That makes it dangerous for bonds. The problem is that the bond money, once it passes, most bonds, at least the ones I've seen, don't have specific outlines of what they're going to spend the money on. They may have vague generalities. They may have, we need to build a new high school or we need to remodel this elementary school or fix playgrounds or whatever it is. But they don't, when they pass, they don't say, oh, and we're going to spend 15% of this bond on this and 22% on that. And so on and so forth. So in the end, it's really incumbent on parents to make sure that whatever is in the marketing PR, whatever you see in that advertisement for that bond when you're voting on it is what they actually spend the money on, because that is sometimes not the norm in this. So we really need to keep an eye on that and see what's happening. There are bond committees, at least in most of the districts I've seen. They establish a bond oversight committee, so you can join that and you can be on the bond oversight committee and you can raise your hand when they decide to spend money on a new district office rather than remodeling your playgrounds. And that's a good thing as well. But it's very difficult to keep track of and also difficult for parents to have a real impact in that.
Am I right that they usually pass? Like it seems like it seems like um, most of the time, these bonds on the ballot are approved. Is that, do you know if that happens to be true, or is that just me feeling that way where I live?
In California, roughly 2/3 of bonds, I believe, pass.
Okay, yeah.
So it's the majority of them. They made that a little bit more difficult. We have a bunch of arcane rules regarding if a bond is passed for a specific purpose versus a general bond. They have different thresholds for passage. In the last election, I think the lowest percentage of bonds passed that maybe has either ever happened or has happened in recent memory. But I think people are getting a little bit of tax fatigue here. Um,
Yeah, I know that I know that 2 failed last night where in my state, and that one of them in particular, there was quite a big battle about it, and so it does seem like as the parents just get more engaged in general with things going on with schools, asking questions, better, getting a sense of what's being taught and what's not being taught, etcetera, it almost seems like this is just another piece of that, so there may be more engagement to get more information about what's in them, and then I could see then potentially not as many passing as perhaps did before.
yeah, yeah,
But I guess we'll have to see.
bonds are difficult too because the deals that they make are sort of bafflingly bad. The districts hire people that they spend millions of dollars on to design these bonds, but then you see we had a local district, I think Poway Unified, took out a bond that I think was going to generate some 300 or $400 million for the district. In the end, it was going to cost over $1 billion to pay back.
Oh my
And
gosh,
so,
yeah.
that's just, it's a bad deal. And you'd think that they would have smarter people than that. But, that I think that the companies that are all involved are salivating over the, multi-million dollar contracts to build things and not so much looking at what's best for the kids and the people.
I'm thinking now too that I might as well bring up, um, this sort of looming fiscal cliff that everyone is talking about. Well, I shouldn't say everyone, probably no one's really talking about it because I don't think the average parent knows what's on the horizon when these COVID, um, dollars run out. Or sort of cease to exist because they have to be spent by a certain time and then that's it. So, um, and what I'm hearing from sort of the education funding expert type people is that this cliff that's coming will be sort of like nothing we've seen before,
Mhm.
and that large urban districts in particular are going to get absolutely killed because they got so much money in the COVID money that they had to spend, that now it's almost like now they've got to figure out a way to make all these reductions because so many of them use the money to add staff.
Mhm.
And so can you just give again like a sense? I'm not trying to panic people, or I don't want them to suddenly run to their school tomorrow and be like, I heard you're going to cut sports. But what are we looking at? And sort of how did we get to a place that that's what we're heading towards?
Sure. There's three parts to the fiscal cliff problem. First is this COVID funding, the money that was given to schools to ameliorate the COVID crisis. This was supposed to go to, HVAC systems and I don't know, outdoor structures to eat in and, backpack sprayers and all that. In California, at least, a lot of that money got spent on things that are more ongoing costs, like you say, adding staff. In many cases, a lot of that money was spent to give people raises and bonuses. We recently saw a huge raise, in one of our districts. The median total compensation of a teacher in this district is $138,000 a year, but they just gave a 15% raise in there. So, that when you do that, that's the gift that keeps on giving because that 15% is now going to add to their pay, which will then ratchet up the amount it'll cost in the next raise and over and over and over again. So that money is going away. It was huge, by the way. In my district, it's a district that usually has about a $200 million budget. We got $60 million in COVID mitigation funding. So it was about a third of the budget, bigger than they normally get. And of course, they spent it. So the second part of that whole thing is state tax revenue, at least, well, property tax and state tax. As we roll into a situation where maybe taxes are not going to tax collections are not going to be as high. If we get into some kind of a recession or anything like that, we're going to see tax revenue go down. That's going to impact school funding. And lastly is enrollment. Usually funding is determined to some degree by enrollment.
Right.
In your state, not so much maybe with property taxes doing it, but here in California, it is what it's all about. So as more parents choose, well, as demographics change, first of all, people are having less kids. But then as more parents choose other forms of education, homeschooling or charter schools or private schools, which means we end up with less funding as well. So the combination of all of that is the fiscal cliff. And often that can be a reduction of anywhere from 5, 10, 15% in ongoing revenue, which is going to be huge.
Okay. And what is your sense in terms of school administrators? Do you feel like they know that it's coming and they're just like not really, and they're talking about it amongst themselves, maybe behind closed doors, but they're not? Because I don't get the sense the public has any awareness yet at all of what's coming.
No, I don't think that the public does. Unfortunately, the number of people who attend school board meetings is much larger than it used to be, but it's still vanishingly small in the big picture. We have roughly 32,000 parents in my district. We see about 10 of them at school board meetings. So
Let me guess, and it's always the same ones.
it is always the same ones, but that's significant. It used to be me. I for about a decade I was going to school board meetings, and basically it was just me, unless there was some really controversial issue on the agenda. But now at least we've got 10 or 15 parents that routinely attend. But you would have to go to those meetings to know that your fiscal cliff is happening. If you go to that meeting, so in most districts they adopt a new budget in January or in June at the beginning of the fiscal year, and then they have periodic updates. They call them interim reports. So if you go to that meeting and you look at their interim report, the next one is probably scheduled for December. They will give a presentation, and in that presentation, they give a future forecast. They call it the multi-year outlook. So when you look at that, that's where you'll see the fiscal cliff. Undoubtedly, whoever's in charge of your district finances, the CBO, they usually call him Chief Business Officer, they will have some form of presentation that will show you that revenue is going away in future years and how that's impacting everything. So are they doing something about it? That's a different question, really. I think they know about it. I don't think there's any question that they know it's going to happen. But I think that they're just, as they often do, just sort of crossing their fingers and hoping that it isn't going to impact them. And then fundamentally, because education is a monopoly, because you can't leave with your kids and your money if you want to, they, in a way, almost don't care. They know that if things get a little worse in your school district, you have no option. You can't leave. So, whether when they have a choice of giving themselves a raise versus cutting back a little bit here and there, which way they're going to go. It's just natural human nature. So parents have to push back on that as well.
Okay. Now, the elephant in the room, how do the teachers' unions fit into all of this? And I say
Well,
that as a person, I was an NEA member in 2 states. Not by choice. That's another thing that was forced and not optional. But obviously they're major players in this. In fact, one of the things that it seems like they think and or will be pushing for is, well, you gave us all this money, we can't make all these cuts, that would be so terrible. So you need to, like, the spigot needs to stay on. You can't.
mhm,
But I also feel like that's not realistic, and that is not going to happen because that would be impossible.
mhm. Sure. No, taxes are going to be you're going to be asked to vote for tax increases. There's no question about that. As for where the teachers unions fit into this, um, first of all, I can tell you I'm a supporter of unions in general. Private unions, they have a place. They have a place for to keep employees doing well. The problem is, though, in a private union, if your boss gives you a raise, he has to look at how is he going to keep the business in operation, and most importantly, how is he going to pay himself? If the boss gives an employee too much money and the business starts to decline, that's bad for everyone. In public unions, though, the employees hire the bosses. The employees, they support the election They fund it. They do everything they can to get people who agree with them onto the school boards. And then, of course, when they come to the bosses for a raise, what are they going to say? The boss is going to say, sure, of course, because if I don't give you this raise, you're going to end up voting me out, or you're not going to support me in the next election, and that's going to result in voting me out. So we have to do this. So that is kind of the fundamental problem with the way that public unions work, is the fact that the union itself is in control of the boss, and then the boss is the one who provides benefits to the union. So it's a nonstop cycle of dysfunction, really. So that's the problem I have with teachers unions.
And also what we've noticed too, the teachers unions, they're certainly not the only people pushing on these ideologies in schools, but they're a major player. So getting back to this sort of the past few years where we've just seen an explosion of DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. And in that, again, that would be including the amount that they pay these vendors to administer these surveys to students that have become increasingly intrusive and invasive, certainly in my opinion, and other expenditures, around obviously people, DEI staff. They tend to be very highly paid administrators. There's been a huge expanse in that. So I know that you said that labor obviously is like the biggest piece of the pie, but have you seen a significant increase um, in terms of districts prioritizing, again, what I'm going to loosely put in this DEI bucket? And obviously, if they're prioritizing it, channeling funds in that direction.
I'm certainly sure that's true. I haven't done any analysis of that, but I can just look at my local district that is now spending probably many times what they used to spend on that in that bucket. It's hard to really analyze because they put it in so many different ways. Some of it is like professional development. They'll dump it into that for the teachers. Some of it is the cost of staff. Sometimes that DEI director supposedly has no staff, but yet he has people who work for him. So it's really hard to get at. But in terms of total money, it's not that big, but in terms of impact it could have spending on something else, it can be huge. I can tell you, I recently did an analysis of a pay increase for a school district here, Temecula Valley, which people may know out there because they've kind of taken the forefront at standing tall on some of these issues. And I looked at what their recent raise to administrators cost the district. And then I compared that to the number of classes they have. So one of the things that teachers have a problem with is funding school supplies. We hear all the time how much money teachers spend on school supplies for their classroom. So you would think that that would be kind of a priority. If you look at just that one raise they gave to their administrators in Temecula Valley, if they spread that out among all the classrooms in the district, that would be $100 per classroom per teacher to spend on school supplies. So, and the amount of that raise is significantly lower, I'm sure, than what they spend on DEI. So if they took the DEI budget for each district and instead they gave it to teachers and said, here you go, go buy Post-its and paper towels and all the stuff that you need for your classroom. Let's stop making you beg for that from parents, and we'll give you this money. That would have a much greater impact than the supposed impact of the DEI programs and such.
Do you think it would be a worthwhile use of parents' time and energy to sort of try to pull together that DEI spending? I know you're saying that, some of it's going to show up in trainings, it's going to show up in lots of different parts of the budget. Does that seem like something that's like would be a worthwhile effort, or not really, because it's not a big enough piece of the pie, despite the fact that obviously if you are focusing on that or you're paying for that, there's all these other, again, literacy interventions, math interventions, like what you're describing, school supplies, etc.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think anything is good. I mean, it's difficult, but I mean, as John F. Kennedy said, we do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard.
Yeah.
So, yes, you could, getting some of the big parts of DEI are probably not that difficult. You can make a Public Records Act request. Every state that I know of has its equivalent. California calls it the California Public Records Act. Some of them call them Freedom of Information. There's various ways to get this. And you can ask the district, if you don't have a transparent California, here you can just look up the DEI director and see how much he costs. That's easy. You can do a Public Records Act to ask, okay, who else is on his staff? Who are the direct costs? And given that 90 some percent of school expense is in labor, you'll probably get to 90% of your DEI cost by doing that. After that,
Interesting.
if you look at the school board documents, you'll often find requests to approve some expense. It'll be, okay, we want the board to approve $200,000 for a new curriculum on DEI training, or we want the board to approve $300,000 for teacher professional development on DEI, and so on and so forth. So you can find that. You can ask the district, can you give me data on all of your DEI related costs? The problem with that is that, of course, they're going to spin that in a way. I mean, they may say, well, we're sending teachers for professional development anyway. It's not a DEI cost,
Right.
so you don't see that. But if you look at just basically the salary of the DEI director and the staff that work for them, plus maybe a few of these programs that they document in board meetings, you can come up with probably 70, 80% of the cost right there. And then go to the board, go stand up in front of the board meeting and say, okay, why don't we spend this on classroom supplies? Why don't we spend this on low-income kids? Why don't we spend this on, bus service for a different neighborhood or something that really benefits parents, kids, and education? That's what we need to do.
I wasn't planning on asking this, but I just thought of it. Since California is, as far as I know, but you're the only state that I'm aware of that requires an ethnic studies course in order to graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And we've looked through the curriculum and the lessons and, of many, many districts in California, and they all seem to be this very sort of insidious version of ethnic studies called liberated ethnic studies.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys have at Transparency California, like, would you guys be able to say this is what the state has spent on this initiative, which I know started years ago, and there's been arguments about the curriculum? Like, is that the kind of thing that a person could look up to see what is this ethnic studies curriculum, which, many of us have been sort of sounding the alarm over, but that's gotten a lot louder since October 7th and the massacre in Israel, because now
Mm-hmm.
people are sort of being able to connect a lot of the language they're hearing on college campuses and in some of these student protests and walkouts is pretty identical to some of the language in this curriculum and in these lessons. So do you have a sense of that at all, or could people who are watching look that up at your place?
No, we don't accumulate data on the budget details of the school districts. The state has that. There is actually a database in the state that if you're a computer dweeb, you can download the database and you can, slice and dice the numbers using that. But I can tell you, being a computer dweeb and a data guy, it's difficult for me. It's probably not easy for people who don't live in Excel or Access or database programming. So I, probably the only way to get that again would be to go to the district itself and ask them that. Fundamentally, regardless of how much they're actually spending on this, the fundamental question I have is what class is that ethnic studies class replacing? I'm all in favor of ethnic studies in general. I mean, we should treat everyone equally, of course. And we should learn about the horrendous past of the United States and our states when it comes to oppressing minorities and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, isn't math perhaps a little bit higher of a priority? Is there no way that we can work in, the history of difficult ethnic situations into history class, or social studies, or places where it generally lives anyway? Maybe we should spend a little bit more time on math and English, science, things like that, things that parents want their kids to excel in. So that's what I would be in favor of.
All right, let's shift to school board members and the role that they play in all of this. So, in terms of what you're sort of describing as bloated budgets or raises or, expenditures that are really hard to justify, sort of how would you describe the role that they play in what we're talking about?
School board members approve everything. So technically, a school board is in charge of the superintendent, and that's it. The school board isn't in charge of the local teachers. They aren't in charge of the principal. They aren't in charge of basically anybody except the superintendent. But the school board can go to the superintendent and give him direction. He works for them. So they could say to the superintendent, bring me back data on this, or we would like you to implement a program doing that. And the superintendent would either have to do it or he could be fired by the school board. With that, then when the district proposes different programs and things, the school board will approve them. So the school board, at least, is in charge of approving, for example, contract pay raises, what I call bonus raises for labor groups and employees. The school board can say no. We recently saw a little bit of back and forth in Temecula Valley, again, where they were pushing back on a set of raises that this district had proposed, particularly in part because the administration was going to receive the same raises for basically doing nothing. There was no benefit being provided. They also had some issues with just specific salaries within the school board. Temecula was paying for the salary of the union president. So the school board and the school district was actually paying the salary of the person who's negotiating against the school district. So they find these things out, and they have the ability to highlight that and to bring it up and even make changes if they want to. The school board is pretty important when it comes to these things. Everything revolves around them. So we need people on the school board who are willing to stand up for kids and do what's right.
How often do you feel that the members of a school board don't understand what they are voting on? And
Almost.
I say that as somebody, so I was
Yeah.
on an elected school board.
Hmm.
It was a running joke that you wouldn't put me on, like, the finance committee because that wouldn't have been my strength. I was on a subcommittee related to student achievement, much better fit. But and I'm not trying to paint with a broad brush and try to imply that these people don't know what they're doing. It's just that everybody comes to the table with different skill sets and different capacities, and school budgets are very complicated and complex. So, what is your sense in terms of, yes, they have to vote and to approve it, but how many of them have the confidence or the expertise to sort of really truly understand what it is that's in front of them?
Very few. I mean, I don't know actually in data how that is, but I can tell you that if you look at any school board race, the number one criteria is, have you been a teacher? That is kind of the criteria. It's just, meanwhile, schools districts are sometimes huge enterprises. I mean, some of our school districts in California have budgets that are over $1 billion a year. They're big financial enterprises. Now, if I had a business that had over $1 billion a year in revenue, I would love to have some members on the school board or on the board of directors for that organization that had a feel for empathy with employees and how to manage a local store and all this stuff. But what I really want are guys that understand numbers.
Yeah.
What I really want, and school boards really don't have that. It's very rare that you see anybody on a school board. I consult with school boards here in California. I've offered my services to look at their budget and look at what's coming up and kind of slice it and dice it and give them a hand. And I can tell you that I find school board members that are just totally surprised all the time about some of the things that are built into the budget, that are hidden in the budget. This whole Me Too raise thing, where the administration of a district gets the same raise that they give to employees, which is common in California, is almost unknown in our state. School board members just don't know that the people who are negotiating with the deal with the union are going to get the same raise themselves when they sign the deal. It's got to be one of the more corrupt things there is in education, but school board members don't know it. So yeah, I'd like to see people when they're voting, to get the blinders off about, like, does this person have a teaching background? We need people like that on the board, absolutely. But we also need people who understand the numbers and make sure things are getting spent right.
Or maybe it's like, but it would be better if you had, like, that you've been teaching high school calculus and
Yeah.
statistics, and you're not, a second grade teacher, as sweet as and great as you may be. Like, yeah. It will not surprise you to know that when I was on the school board, at the same time, a new person came on and then became the chair, and he had been a total math nerd in high school and college, math major. He had run a business forever, and so when he
Mhm.
came on, it was like suddenly like the whole culture shifted because in addition to him being excellent with numbers, he wasn't going to do anything till he had been provided numbers, and even
Mm.
that was new. So he'd
Mhm.
be like, "I'm sorry, but like we're not voting on something till I have a fiscal note in my hand." And at first it was like, "What's his problem?" So you could see that just to bring even one person who's a leader, who really knows their stuff, can make such a big difference. And I sort of wish everybody could have on their school board that guy that we had. He's actually the mayor of my town now.
Ah,
But okay, I think we're going to get close to wrapping up, but we always like to leave parents with action items so that they feel like there's like a what can I do as it relates to my school budget and holding my school accountable for spending. And it needs to be doable for somebody who's, not a math expert or a budget expert and who might even feel intimidated by some of the things that we discussed today. Um, and honestly, I feel like you may have already mentioned them, but do you want to just reiterate sort of like some action items for parents that you think can really make a difference?
sure. Yeah. Item number one is to make sure you understand the school's budget. Now, again, that's difficult, but I can tell you that in any parent group, there are parents that get this. I'm that parent in our group here in Oceanside. I mean, I managed a division of a national retailer for a while, so I get the budget process and I understand big numbers and how they work out. And we sit down together with a group before every school board meeting, a couple days beforehand, and we go through the board agenda and people ask me questions. How much is this going to cost? Where is this coming from? Why are these numbers here? And I do what I can to answer them. And then I make public records requests if I can to find that out. So there are parents out there that are skilled at this, and you need to make use of them. But number one is really just to make sure that you're aware of when these things are coming up in front of the school board. Go read the agendas, go to the school board meetings. It's only a couple hours a month. I mean, I see parents that tell me they're too busy to go to school boards. Meanwhile, they're very familiar with what the Kardashians are doing. And I and I think, okay, you've got hours every week to watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians or whatever the show is, The Bachelor or whatever. But you don't have 2 hours to go sit in a school board meeting so you know what your district is doing. It just seems like priorities are a little bit out of whack at times. So go to the school board meeting, make sure that you pay a little bit of attention when they're talking about budget issues, ask questions. If you have to, find a parent who might understand this a little bit better, and then just make sure that you're keeping an eye on things and stand up at the podium and talk. Make sure that the board knows that you're watching. Even if you don't know all the details, if you get up there and you say, okay, why are we not funding this program for low-income kids to learn to read, in the next school budget, they'll know at least, gee, somebody's watching. Maybe I should pay attention to that. So absolutely. And join committees. Schools have budget committees. So if there's a budget committee, a bond committee, something like that, join it. You don't have to be an expert to be there. You'll just learn something. So do that too.
That's a great point that you make about them knowing that people are watching, because it's funny, people will joke about how, nobody even reads the paper anymore or whatever, and they're always like, "Yeah, but the people in power do."
Hmm.
They notice, and so when suddenly there's what do they say? If I get 5 calls on something, it gets my attention. If I get 10 calls on something, it really gets my attention. If I get 15 calls on something, um and to your point too, I would just say to people too, like if you're not comfortable with all the numbers, etc., the issue of transparency itself, it's a much sort of easier to understand concept, and it's certainly something worthy of demanding from your school districts. All right,
Hmm.
Todd. So there are going to inevitably probably be some people who would like to follow you in your work, and maybe even support what you're doing at Transparent California. So where can they find you?
Sure. Transparentcalifornia.com is the website. Transparent's down there on the
There we
screen.
go. It's on the screen.
There you go. Thank you. So you can go there. If you're in California, you can look up whatever your local officials make, your schools, your districts. What I think is kind of interesting is when I see a line of, say, during contract negotiations, I will see a line of teachers speaking at the podium, talking about how awful it is, and how they need to take this money away from the kids' education to give to themselves. And I look them up while I'm there in the audience, and I said, "Gee, I had one teacher who was talking about how awful it is to make her car payment. She made $194,000 last year." So I'm thinking, okay, I think I'd rather have some money spent on math, than
Yeah,
that. So yeah.
that's this would be too long of a conversation, but I do want to throw out there for people the reminder that like there is a narrative about teacher pay, and the reality is it just varies wildly
Mhm.
district to district and state to state. So there are teachers in the state of Oklahoma who qualify for public assistance because they
Hmm.
make so little money. I think I
Hmm.
looked at one point, you had to be teaching 13 years to even make $38,000.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
is obviously a conversation we need to have. It's to use a popular word, deplorable.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, like in Boston, the average teacher's salary there was over 100,000, but close to
Hmm.
100, not as high as what you said, and that shocks people
Yeah.
because the narrative, of course, is always about this terrible, terrible pay and what you just cited of 194,000. So I would caution people just watching and listening. The teacher pay is extremely variable, not only state to state, but within a state. You can have districts in a state that teachers are making a lot of money and drive 30 minutes and they're making far, far less. Um, so again, yes, like cheer for the places where the pay and the conditions are absolutely unacceptable, but be aware that you're also getting shook down or shaken down a lot by um, districts where they make far, far more than most of the people paying taxes to the district and voting in the elections.
Yeah, no, in California we have that variation, and I tell the truth, I'm not somebody who thinks, say, teachers are overpaid. I hear that, in some areas because of the 180-day work schedule, but not me. I think teachers are fairly paid. I'm very glad we can pay teachers in California a fair amount of money. I'm very happy that we teachers in California make about $30,000 a year more than privately educated or comparably educated private residents, and I'm fine with that. The problem comes when we decide to reallocate money and to give, say, more money to teacher raises as opposed to more money to math programs or things like that. So that's where something like Transparent California comes into effect. So in that, if you want to go to Transparent California and you're in California and you want to support us, what you can do is sponsor an agency. If you bring up your local school district, for example, you'll see a blue sponsor button. You can click that. It's $25. It's not a huge amount of money. What it does is not only sponsor the collection of that data, which can be difficult. School districts don't always want to give it to you. It's not an automatic thing. There's fights that go on. We've sued people. Um, but that'll also prioritize collection. So if you have a small school district somewhere and you want to see its data faster, sponsor it, and you'll see that data faster. There are other. Every state has. Many states have that. Washington State, for example, they collect this data and they have their own database. I don't know what it's called, but if you're in Washington State, you can look it up and you can find the same information. There are other states that do the same thing as well. So do some googling, and you can figure it out.
Yeah, and ask around. Like now, I'm going to ask some people that I know now that I know about your organization. I'm going to ask people who would potentially know what we have where I live and say, "Do we have anything like this?" And so everybody should sort of do that. Reach out to your network or go online and see, like, do you have something similar to this in your state that you could begin, checking in with, using, supporting, etc. All right.
Hmm.
Well, Todd, it's been really, really great chatting with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know that it was sort of early where you are. And
Nah.
to everybody else watching, I hope this conversation has been helpful. We haven't really talked very much about budget stuff here at PDE, so this was sort of a nice change of pace, but also something very important. Again, especially as the all of that money that poured into districts in what are kind of referred to as COVID funds, ESSER money also. So this is going to be a topic in the coming, 18 year and 18 months. And so this is sort of like our budget 101 start to that. So again, thanks to Todd. And as always, make sure that you remember that we're here if you have concerns about something happening in your child's school, if there are policies you find troubling, if there are lessons, assignments, surveys, etc., or you just even have questions, or you're curious, or you even need support figuring out what questions to ask, we are here for that. So you can find us at defendinged.org. And please reach out anytime. Also, share this video with a friend and tag us at Defending Ed. Todd, thanks again. And to
Thank you.
everybody watching and listening, we so appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And with that, take care and we'll see you soon.
Yep. Thanks.